We were actually extremely good friends, but people always tried to portray us as adversaries. Fans are in disbelief after 76-year-old Ric Flair finally speaks out about Hulk Hogan's passing. This farewell isn't what everybody anticipated. No tactful remembrance, no well-planned nostalgia. Rather, Flair presents an unvarnished and intensely intimate reality that is causing division in the wrestling community. However, what really triggered everything was what he allegedly said in private. Insider rumors are circulating, fans are incensed, and the legacy of one of wrestling's greatest heroes feels more murky than ever. Why now? Why this message too? The version of the narrative that no one else is willing to share is going to be told to you. Hogan's burden. Hulk Hogan did not appear to be the towering figure that millions of people knew from the heyday of professional wrestling in the last months of his life. He was no longer pumping the audiences or posing in the ring. The man who had once been praised as the strongest in the industry was gradually disintegrating behind closed doors. He was catching up on everything spiritually, emotionally, and physically. Hogan was 71 and had had more procedures than some hospitals do in a typical week. His knees were battered, his shoulders were rebuilt, his back had been opened up 11 times, and both hips had been replaced. Additionally, he had a complex neck treatment that left him with restricted mobility just months before he passed away. Discomfort, therapy, and painkillers weren't sporadic obstacles. They were part of his everyday life. Reports state that although Hogan rarely voiced grievances to the public, his closest associates witnessed a different side of him. He was worn out not in a superficial, everyday sense, but in a profound, inner sense. According to friends, he had trouble getting out of seats on his own. He stopped going to a lot of wrestling events because it had become a nuisance to traverse a room, not because he didn't want to. Then there was leukemia, specifically chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Not many people knew about it. Hogan had kept it under wraps because he wanted the world to remember him in red and yellow, not the man fighting a sickness that consumed him in the background. He was not looking for pity. Pity was not what he wanted. However, he was aware that the end was drawing near. He spent the majority of his last days at home in Clearwater, Florida. According to reports, he declined any major hospital stays. Just silence, no drama, no press. However, such quiet did not imply tranquility. It meant being alone. His past several weeks have been disturbing, according to one buddy. It was because of how still everything had become, not because of any dramatic event. His last chapter was one of silence for a guy whose life had been characterized by clamor, booming arenas, applauding fans, and dramatic interviews. And for those who knew him, perhaps that was the most painful part. The silence, the lack, the knowledge that the man who had once epitomized American bravery, power, and fortitude could hardly raise his arms without flinching. Some claim that Hogan had accepted it, that he had anticipated it, and that he had decided to end things on his own terms, rather than making them into a publicity circus. Some claim that he withdrew because he was unable to confront the shadow of the man he had become. The outcome was the same regardless of the cause. For the public, the news of his passing came as a shock, but for those who knew him, it was a slow-motion conclusion they had been watching for months. He had a heart attack and died. However, that last second was merely the last fissure in a foundation that had been eroding for years. There were many ways in which his heart had become overburdened. The world's wrestling fans were in mourning. Social media was inundated with tributes. Celebrities told tales. Other wrestlers shared old pictures. It appeared that everyone had something to say. Ric Flair was one of them. Others, however, praised the legacy, although Flair's tone would soon change. Nobody anticipated what happened next. A history etched in perspiration and treachery. Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair had a relationship that was formed in the midst of wrestling's most brutal period. Long before tributes and headlines, their names were always close to each other. Flair followed and followed Hogan wherever he went. They were more than just symbols. They were competitors, allies, rivals, and sometimes adversaries. Despite everything, they were able to understand one another in a manner that no one else could. Their feud predates both the intensity of WCW's Monday Nitro and the lights of WrestleMania. As the spokesperson for WWF in the 1980s, Hogan helped popularize professional wrestling. In the meantime, Flair was ruling the NWA as the flamboyant technical genius who stole the show without the need for flashy colors or finger-pointing. Hogan had superhuman abilities. The bad guy was Flair, and neither of them was adequate for the fans. The two did not directly clash until the 1990s, when WCW was in place. Although their battles were thrilling, the true drama took place behind the scenes. Insiders claim that Hogan's political scheming and creative control clauses were a stark contrast to Flair's orthodox outlook. At times, it almost tore the locker room apart, because they both wanted the attention. However, it was precisely this tension and friction that gave their rivalry its legendary status. Back then, neither man would ever openly acknowledge it. However, they supported and encouraged one another, and even though one of them left the arena in a rage, he was still in a better state than when he arrived. It wasn't all business, though. A deeper bond was developing behind the scenes. Hogan would finally come to terms with Flair, in their hardships, not in their personalities. Both experienced financial difficulties at various times. Both faced the agonizing reality of their bodies failing after decades of punishment, as well as damaged families, public scrutiny, and health problems. Mutual abrasion has a strangely uplifting effect. Later on, Flair would acknowledge that Hogan had been more helpful to him than most people realized. Hogan occasionally provided him with cash, checked in when others didn't, and stood up for him when the media ignored him. They were connected by a thread that never really broke, even when they weren't talking much. However, theirs was hardly a tale of two closest friends going on retirement cruises together. Their connection was still erratic. Following a WCW event that almost brought an end to their relationship, Flair and Hogan got into a real-life fight in 1999. Flair thought the way the game went was disrespectful. Hogan allegedly failed to recognize the problem. Time, as usual, smoothed the edges after tempers rose and voices were shouted. The tone changed in the last few years. Both of them had visible and unseen scars, were older, and were worn down. Hogan had mostly distanced himself from the spotlight. However, Flair continued to be as vocal as ever, showing up at events, tweeting, and letting everyone know he was still alive and well. Even Flair, though, had begun to slow down, and that familiar fire appeared to dull, if only briefly, when word spread of Hogan's passing. Because it was more than just a loss for a wrestler or a coworker, it had to do with history. Flair lost a mirror instead of a buddy, someone who embodied the positive and negative aspects of a life in the spotlight. And that's why so many people were taken aback by what happened next. Flair didn't use well-chosen words or a neat tribute. He conveyed decades of shared history, pride, and suffering, along with unadulterated, uncensored emotion. He wasn't speaking on behalf of a company. He was speaking from the perspective of a man who had run out of people, who genuinely knew what that life was all about. Furthermore, supporters weren't prepared for the type of message he delivered when he did open up. The paradox of survivors. Ric Flair did not withdraw into quiet in the days after Hulk Hogan's death. He did not disappear from view. However, there was a change in him. The high spirit and his typical confidence that fans had been accustomed to were muted. His eye still had some shine, but it was less intense. And according to those closest to him, a guy struggling with something far more serious was hiding behind his public persona and casual comments. The guilt of survivors. Flair has never been a moderate person. Tremendous charisma, resilience, and confidence, but also tremendous fragility. He has escaped death more times in his lifetime than most wrestlers have held the title. His career was almost over when he suffered a broken back in a plane disaster in 1975. After experiencing multiple organ failure in 2017, he was put into a medically induced coma and given a 2% chance of life. He has been diagnosed with and recovered from skin cancer twice. He has outlived his family, friends, and even his own kid. Therefore, Flair was taken aback by Hogan's death, who seemed to be a larger-than-life character who was virtually impervious to the passage of time. He started to emotionally spiral, according to people close to him. In secret, not publicly, not in a dramatic breakdown. Anxious tirades about aging, legacy, and whether he had said enough were interspersed with extended periods of stillness. He reportedly asked pals, "Why am I still here?" on multiple occasions, not in a self-deprecating manner, but rather out of sheer incredulity. Because Flair, who was 5 years older than Hogan, was still physically healthy, whereas Hogan had become a recluse in his later years due to surgery and discomfort. He mentioned no chronic diseases or aches. It worried him, and it was confusing. A peculiar sort of imbalance was produced by the juxtaposition between the eerie life of one emblem and the physical deterioration of another. It was incomprehensible to Flair. He started thinking about Hogan's suffering in public, the emotional toll of witnessing his body disintegrate while everyone else expected him to remain the Hulkster, in addition to the physical one. In interviews, Flair talked about how difficult it had become for Hogan to walk, move, and lead a regular life. Despite this, Hogan never sought pity. He eschewed spectacle for dignity. That insight set off something, even in his last days for Flair, a need to talk, a necessity to face not only Hogan's passing but all that it stood for: remorse, legacy, and time. When your whole identity was based on being one of your peers, what does it mean to outlive them? Therefore, it should come as no surprise that his final message would evoke strong feelings. The fact that he spoke, however, was not what most shocked them. It was his speech pattern. There was no publicist to smooth the edges, no filter. There was no press release here. Whether or not fans were prepared for them, it was a man expressing his innermost feelings. And all that came after was made possible by that unwavering, raw honesty that was based on decades of shared history. Flair did more than simply pay homage. He was honest as he saw fit, and he broke the silence by starting a firestorm. There was no grandiose announcement, no spectacular comeback to the limelight. For the first time since Hogan's death, Flair just made a public statement. His message was succinct yet unambiguous. I believe he simply became weary. 2 hip replacements, 11 back procedures, and a neck operation. How much can your body handle, really? He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't make things up. His speech carried a tone of resignation, the kind of fatigue that only comes from witnessing a loved one gradually lose their soul. Additionally, Flair included something that drew in a lot of viewers. Even though I am 5 years older than the Hulk, I still have no physical aches or pains. I find that annoying. Naturally, I'm anxious that I might be the next. His public comments elicited a mixed response, but no uproar. The statement struck many fans as sorrowful, if not courteous. They valued the humanity and honesty. Flair wasn't on stage, speaking as a man who had witnessed too many of his friends pass away too soon rather than as a showman. He was thinking. That was just the surface, though. Sources close to Flair claimed that there was more to the intimate chats he had been having behind closed doors that weren't intended for the cameras. And everything changed when those words started to circulate online. Prior to his public remarks, Flair reportedly told a close buddy, "I can't stay silent anymore." People continue to act as though Hogan's passing was spectacular. He didn't. He was wretched. He detested being perceived in that manner, unable to walk, unable to move. He didn't want to be remembered that way. The comment quickly went viral. Indeed, when Ric Flair finally spoke out about Hulk Hogan's passing, at the age of 76, his remarks infuriated fans. It was more than just an observation to a lot of admirers. It was a stomach punch. It felt like a betrayal of the hero they looked up to, when Flair said that Hogan was ashamed of his condition. In stark contrast to the mythical image of the guy who once crushed giants and instructed millions to take their vitamins and pray. It depicted a fragility they didn't want to see. A few fans reacted angrily. Discussions on social media became heated. There was a lot of discussion on wrestling boards. One post said, "How dare he speak for Hogan like that? Instead of changing the conclusion, he should be paying tribute to his friend." Others said Flair twisted grief into commentary that wasn't his to offer, making Hogan's death about himself. However, there was another side as well. More and more voices spoke up for Flair, saying that if anyone had earned the right to speak honestly, it was Flair. It was the man who had known Hogan for more than 40 years, both inside and beyond the ring. They did not consider Flair's leaked remarks to be offensive. They were unpolished. Yes, uncomfortable, but grounded in reality. Flair hadn't destroyed Hogan's legend, after all. He had lamented the silent agony of a man who lived out his last years in agony and out of sight, away from the spotlight that had once characterized him. "I can't stay silent anymore" became a phrase unto itself. Some thought it was superfluous. Some thought it was courageous. Regardless of the viewpoint, it caused a commotion. Flair made no effort to relax. Ric Flair did not break his silence at the age of 76, with a tribute that flawlessly recapped Hogan's memories. He was honest when he broke it, perhaps too much of it. And the message was clear regardless of whether fans felt seen or deceived. Men coping with suffering, dread, and dwindling legacies were hidden beneath the legends and larger-than-life characters. Not everyone was prepared to deal with the consequences of that. Ric Flair's comments regarding Hulk Hogan did not elicit a particularly strong reaction. There was no concerted pushback, no viral indignation, and no big headlines. That was not the case. However, it caused a great deal of unease in the wrestling world, the circles that actually watched these men and were aware of their pasts. Not because of Flair's public remarks, but rather because of the rumors that had circulated since. In his measured, even courteous, official statement, Flair discussed Hogan's anguish, his surgeries, and his fortitude. He thought about how odd it was to be 5 years older and still physically fit, but his lifelong friend had suffered through his latter years. It was vulnerable and honest. That was appreciated by most fans. However, when rumors about Flair's private comments started to circulate, the unease increased. According to reports, he had said to a friend, "I can't stay silent anymore." He then said something more direct. People continued to act as though Hogan won. He didn't. He detested being perceived in that manner. He was truly broken by that. It was never cited in print. Although it didn't make the news, it was sufficient that members in the wrestling community were discussing it, cautiously and privately. Some thought Flair had gone too far. Hogan never made the decision to say those things himself, not because they were untrue. Hogan wouldn't have included that in his account if he had been embarrassed by his appearance toward the end, and had opted to hide rather than go out in public. It was something he had never asked anyone to explain. Despite having the greatest of intentions, Flair's choice to fill in that blank caused discomfort for others. Others were fully aware of Flair's perspective. They had witnessed the same events. During his last year, Hogan had declined appearances. He stayed away from cameras. Even at the expense of his job, he opted for seclusion. He was not looking for pity. He wished to maintain the perception that others still held of him, the powerful, arrogant, and irresistible force. Although Flair's remarks gave that image more substance, they didn't erase it. A lot of folks weren't prepared to face it. In actuality, there was never going to be a flawless way to discuss what transpired with Hulk Hogan in his latter years. His physical deterioration hurt. He had severe health problems, but he said nothing. He didn't want his sorrow to be seen by everyone, and even though his death wasn't abrupt, that silence gave the impression that it was. People felt uneasy with Flair's decision to talk about that quiet and to gently break it. He was not malevolent. He was straightforward but not rude. And when it comes to their heroes, wrestling fans sometimes struggle to comprehend it. The legend, not the guy, is what they're accustomed to. They recall the slams, the promotions, and the entrances. Sometimes they don't want to hear about the solitude, the hospital beds, or how someone gradually loses their fame. Flair made no attempt to alter Hogan's narrative. He only included a chapter that most fans had not read. It was significant even if it didn't match the larger-than-life story. Even while it didn't spark a blaze, it gave people a more profound grasp of what aging in this industry actually entails. The comments Flair said provoked silent contemplation among wrestlers. There were no interviews or announcements, only casual remarks, nods, and a few texts between veterans who understood exactly what he meant. Others had experienced it. They were afraid they would experience it themselves. Nobody yelled at Ric Flair. However, something had changed. The discourse around Hogan's last years was less pristine than it always was. Even though it wasn't welcome, something honest had touched it. And that was the goal for Flair. The reality that refused to be hidden. Ric Flair made no explanations in the days that followed. He didn't retract his statements. He made no follow-up remarks. Nor did he refute the private quotation that had gradually crept into the communal consciousness of the wrestling community. Rather, he stayed silent, not in retreat, but rather in a state of acceptance. His words were already in the public domain. More significantly, he felt that it was something that had to be said. The passing of Hulk Hogan meant more to Flair than simply losing a friend. It marked the end of a period in wrestling history where few people remained to speak for it. The majority of the famous people who had once traversed those cruel circuits, who had constructed their bodies into machines and then destroyed them for amusement, were either deceased or had lost their ability to communicate. Despite everything, Flair remained upright, awake, and able to recall the true cost of everything. His words were unique because of this. They weren't elegant, joyous remembrances intended to appease the masses. They came from a man who had outlived the image, who had lived it, and who had seen things that the spotlight doesn't show. "I think he just got tired," Flair stated, not in an attempt to downplay Hogan's significance. He attempted to describe the toll. Furthermore, he wasn't judgmental when he stated in private that he didn't want to be perceived that way. It was acknowledged. Flair has seen others with that similar expression. When a guy who once ruled the globe now hesitated to unlock the front door, he knew what it meant. Hogan wasn't being portrayed as weak by him. He was serving as a reminder that sometimes choosing to remain silent is a sign of true strength, even when the noise of the audience had been the foundation of your entire life. Nevertheless, the uneasiness persisted. because Flair had unintentionally exposed the fact that wrestling doesn't usually let its heroes age well. When they are at their best, it demands everything of them. And when their bodies stop cooperating, it frequently abandons them. Furthermore, it's simpler to believe that those same heroes are just sleeping, rather than quietly suffering when they fade from the public eye. Flair was aware of that. He had experienced both sides. He had been in the lead. He had lost everything. He would return. In addition, he had buried more friends than he wanted to remember. There is a cost to that kind of survival, one that is impervious to delusions. There are still fans who wish he hadn't revealed some things. Perhaps Hogan would have liked that as well. Quietness, however, is something Flair never was. And perhaps that was the idea after all. What others were too scared to acknowledge had to be spoken. That the conclusion isn't always what the movies depict. That our greatest heroes can occasionally disappear without a trace. Not with a championship game, but with a door shut and too much suffering to describe. Flair didn't mean to offend. He couldn't bear it any longer, so he said it. Even if that fact was unsettling, it created room for something that wrestling doesn't often accept: introspection. The sort that asks us what we owe the people who gave us their bodies, their health, and ultimately their peace, not the kind that is centered on highlights or title belts. In memory, the red and yellow will never fade, but so will the fact that even legends become weary, and perhaps that is something worth remembering as well. How do you feel about the confession made by Ric Flair? Tell us in the comments section.